Okay, we'll call this morning's meeting to order. Heather?
Roll call, Mr. Chairman. Is
Roll
Senator
call.
Anderson,
Here.
Senator
We'll
Furphy,
call this morning's meeting to order. No, we don't need that.
Roll- Okay. Senator Anderson, you already answered here. Senator Furphy,
Here.
Senator McEwen,
Here.
Senator Pappas,
Here.
Representative Baker,
Here.
Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Burt,
Here.
Representative Henderson,
Here.
Representative McGuire,
Here.
Representative Obermuller, Representative O'Hearn,
Here.
Representative Stivar,
Present.
Co-Chairman Landon,
Here.
Co-Chairman Burkhart.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Heather. So first up is county road construction maintenance funding. That's tab 11 in your books, for those of you who haven't found it yet. And with that, Jeremiah, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of Wyoming's County Commissioners. It's a pleasure to be before you this morning here in Carbon County, and I look forward to talking to you about the County Road Construction and Maintenance Fund, and certainly hope that I can get you ahead of schedule today. I don't expect this to take a full hour. First off, Mr. Chairman, the County Road Construction and Maintenance Fund is intended to be the primary mechanism for counties to fund construction and maintenance of the roads that are under their responsibility. To give you a little bit of additional background from what's on the document that I provided you, counties are responsible for just under 15,000 miles of road across the state. That is roughly 2/3 of all roads in the state of Wyoming. So in other words, counties are responsible for twice as many miles of road as the municipalities, the state and the federal government combined. So quite a task that they have before them. In terms of the funding, it's considerably less available to them than what you see in those other systems. The County Road Construction and Maintenance Fund in fiscal year 20 generated just over $15 million. So counties, and that's statewide for all counties. So counties certainly have to dip into other available resources in order to do the work that they do. Now, as it relates to the County Road Construction and Maintenance Fund, that funding does come from generally three areas. It comes from a portion of the gas, diesel, and severance taxes. And the percentages vary amongst those. But when the counties receive those from the state, they're responsible for accounting for them separately, and this is by statute, by constitution. They're responsible for accounting for those separately from the other general funds at the county. The idea being that these are special funds that do have statutory and constitutional standards that have to be adhered to and need to be protected. The counties as well, I've provided you with some of their other responsibilities, including developing plans for the use of those funds and where available or allowable costs are. So that's provided in the document. The counties are given some guidance through what's called the County Road Fund Manual. That's a document that is produced about once a decade is what where we're currently working on. And it's last time it was primarily through a working group that the Wyoming Department of Transportation pursued. I've provided a link to that. It's a rather lengthy document. I suspect it would rather bore you, but it does give you and it gives, more importantly, counties guidance on the use of funds, how those are to be contracted, how they are to be bid, and the standards for county roads across the state of Wyoming. That currently is undergoing revision, and that is being undertaken by a working group of the Wyoming County Road Standards Committee. That committee was established by the legislature about a little more than a decade ago, when or perhaps even a little bit less than that, when the County Road Construction and Maintenance Fund was moved from WYDOT to a standalone program within the counties for administration. And that group consists of a number of individuals that are recommended by various groups. So as I've included in your document, our association is listed in one portion of statute as nominating 3 individuals to that board, one of which must be a professional engineer. The governor ultimately makes the selection on all of these. The Wyoming Association of Consulting Engineers and Surveyors has 2 members. The Wyoming Contractors Association, or formerly the Wyoming Contractors Association, now the Wyoming the Associated General Contractors of Wyoming have 1 nomination, and the Wyoming Association of County Engineers and Road Superintendents have another representative. All of those make up the County Road Standards Committee. I've listed what their primary responsibilities are, but one of the major functions that they perform is every year they send out a request for all counties to submit information on the use of funds from the previous fiscal year. And that allows for the committee to then evaluate were counties using the funding appropriately. They then send back a letter to each county based on their evaluation of the report that's submitted, and either tell them you did a good job, and we generally call it a green light on the report. We alert them if there is any concern. Those are usually yellow lights, and then what we've got is the red light, which appear to be major violations of use of the fund. One of the most egregious examples more recently of a red light is using funds to move from the County Construction and Road Maintenance Fund to the general fund of a county. We unfortunately had one county that had done that on a very regular basis. I'm very happy to report it appears that they have, based on the most recent red light that they got, or actually 2 red lights they got, has changed that practice, which is an important thing in ensuring that the fund is used appropriately and that we continue to maintain the support of our partners, namely our contractors across the state of Wyoming, who are in most instances intended to do the work that the County Road Construction and Maintenance Fund the money that it generates. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we have been working with a working group that includes all the members of that County Road Standards Committee to identify some possible changes to the program. As I mentioned, $15 million statewide is what is available to do work within the counties. And we've had some concern expressed by our membership that the current statutory structure, it just doesn't work given the budgetary constraints in a couple of areas. So again, we worked with a a working group, which did include, again, the engineers across the state, our members, our county commissioners, as well as the Contractors Association, to identify some proposed legislative changes. And that's what we bring to you today on the second page of the document that you have before you. So just going through the three proposed changes that we have, the first one is to move the maximum dollar figure by which counties can perform work on their own. And we are proposing to move that from 50,000 to 75,000. So in other words, if a project is less than $75,000, the county can do that work on their own. If it is anything higher, then the county is responsible for ensuring that it's bid out and that private contractors have the opportunity to do that work. For some historical context, the legislature last adjusted this number in 2007. It had been at $25,000 before that, and the legislature moved it up to $75,000. In our working group, up to $50,000, and now we're proposing to move it to $75,000. In our working group, the Contractors Association, and they're certainly behind me and can provide some comment today too, but they've indicated that $100,000 was too high, but this 75,000 is an agreeable figure to move, and our membership certainly appreciates that. Mr. Chairman, the second proposed change to 24.2.110 is in section F, and that is that right now state statute references to specific associations, and formerly the Wyoming Contractors Association is now the Associated General Contractors of Wyoming. So we're proposing to make that simple change to bring it up to standard. Mr. Chairman, the last proposal that we have for you here today deals with purchase of equipment. There has, prior to 2008, counties had the ability to purchase equipment up to $100,000, and that was really left kind of broadly open. As long as it was a construction and maintenance piece of equipment, then a county could pursue that. In 2008, the legislature removed that particular provision. And I think it was intended to ensure that counties weren't purchasing equipment that they might only use for 15 days in any particular year, that is better to have a contractor that is utilizing that on a regular basis, have that equipment. The constraint for counties is that they do have some work that is on a repeated basis, and they've been unable to purchase equipment using this fund, and given the constraints they have on the rest of their budget. My members asked for some allowance to be granted back into statute, and so we've readopted a portion of what was removed in 2008, but we've limited the purchase to road or motor graders. They're one and the same, but the intent is that they could put aside $100,000 in any given year to make that particular equipment purchase. This doesn't allow them to buy a striping machine or some other piece of equipment that, for a chip and seal project. It would be only limited to the purchase of road and motor graders. So we do appreciate your consideration and support of that particular provision. And again, it's with the exception of a change at the very end, a readoption of what had previously been in state statute. Mr. Chairman, I'll close out this presentation to say that there are two other areas that we're continuing to work in our working group on. And the first one is those situations in particular where the county might put work out for bid, but doesn't receive a qualified bid, which has happened on occasion. These are smaller dollar projects, so a lot of contractors have plenty of work out there and are pursuing that. And so it can create in some situations a little bit of a conundrum where the county can't get a qualified bid and can't move forward. The sticky point is ensuring that the counties put forward appropriate bid documents and don't sort of try and game the system, if you will. So that's what we're trying to work through to make sure that we don't set up that sort of a system if we can make any changes there. The second one is that the contractors in particular have been interested in ensuring that we shore up some of the compliance and enforcement provisions. Really, there is none today other than that slap on the wrist that I mentioned from the County Road Standards Committee, which apparently is working to some degree. But we've agreed to continue to have a conversation around that and see if we might be able to come up with a reasonable approach to compliance and enforcement, and one that really doesn't burden you all and getting reports that you don't need and balances things out. So we'll continue to work through the working group there. I just wanted to make sure that you knew we are working in some other areas, but again, do appreciate your consideration of the 3 changes that we proposed here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I take any questions.
Questions for Mr. Raymond? Co-chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Raymond, thank you for all of that. I'm a little slow catching up on the 2008 provision that we struck, and the 100,000, bringing it back in. I'm just trying to come to all the reasons that we might have done that. Can you talk a little bit more about thoughts on that regard? Why do you suppose that was stricken from the statutes? And then what are the ramifications? What are the pros and cons of bringing this back in? I mean, it seems reasonable to me, but was it in an effort to make sure that we're balancing with bringing in our contractors to do a lot of this work? Help me with that, if you would. I'm just not quite there yet.
Mr. Raymond?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, appreciate that question. I'll try and do my best. It's long before my time working on these particular issues, but in gathering information from the various parties, some of which were involved in the program at that time, it appears to be several factors drove that particular change. One, by having the language as broad as it was in 2008 and allowing for counties to purchase a broad spectrum of equipment, whether that be road graders, as I mentioned, road stripers, I'm going to blank on a few of them, but any, a mower, a chip and seal, apparatus, all of those seem to be beyond the intent of the legislature and perhaps could, if not used appropriately, run afoul of the Constitution, which ensures that these funds are used for construction and maintenance activities out across the state. So, for example, if you purchased a mower and that was intended for road construction and maintenance, but you were using it for your parks and recreation and maybe a whole slew of other things, that would be rather, at least it would seem to be inappropriate against what the standards were. So that's one piece. As I understand it as well, there was concern from the contractors that you are potentially using vast amounts of money to purchase equipment and then aren't bidding projects through them to perform work as is intended here. There is a standard for use of the money and when those contracts are to be bid. So it did have a few things that caused concern. What we've tried to do here is recognize that my members do have some activities that absolutely unequivocally are road construction and maintenance activities. The classic one being, purchase of a blade and performing that work. In some cases year round, but certainly during the spring and summer months. And so the agreement that we've kind of come up with is everybody agrees that seems to fit the standard. We should still keep a cap on the amount of money that can be put aside. And let's be honest, $100,000 and the cost of a road grader is probably 50% of it, unless it's a used piece of equipment. So we think we may have struck a little bit of a balance here by bringing it back in and constraining it to that one piece of equipment, which, I'll be honest, some of my members would like to be able to purchase other pieces of equipment, but this was sort of a compromise.
Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Reeman, in your experience as you prepared to visit with us about this issue today, we ran into a couple of counties that pointed to the fact that their equipment is quite aged, and they're really struggling to keep some of the equipment even running. Has that been your experience? Did you talk about that? Can you verify that for us? What'd you find out across?
Mr. Ryman?
Mr. Chairman, I think that if you spoke to commissioners, particularly in your sort of small to medium-sized counties where they don't have as many other resources available to them to raise revenue, they would go on about that. In particular, I'm kind of struck by just a couple of weeks ago when we were in our working group and Commissioner Tom Ryan from Hot Springs County was really kind of explaining his budgetary situation and how far they've had to carry some of their equipment in order to meet the needs of all of our residents. Again, that 2/3 of the roads. And I think if you talk to any county commissioner, they would say the call they most frequently get, outside of during this COVID period, has been and always is about the condition of roads, and they just haven't had the equipment to be able to do that.
Thank you.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, I got a couple things. The way I read this paragraph A is that a contractor could do that work, but it doesn't have to be a competitive bid if it's less than 75,000. And obviously the state could do it, or the county could do it also, but that doesn't preclude a contractor doing that work from the language I'm reading there. And then I'm surprised that you're using road or motor graders when the manufacturers have called them motor graders for 50 years I know of.
Mr. Ryman?
Mr. Chairman, in terms of 24-110A, for any project below $50,000, the county does have the ability to do that work. That's not to say that they always do. There are many instances where they will contract that work out, and it is performed by private contractors. This just gives counties the ability to do that work under that threshold on their own if they would like, again, under the parameters that are established in that county road fund manual and with the assistance of a project engineer and other things. So there is some ability to do things on their own. And all we're changing here is what that dollar threshold is at which they could do that work under it. Mr. Chairman, in terms of road grader versus motor grader, I'll be really honest with you, I Googled this and, found that certain manufacturers call it one thing, others call it another. And so I put both. I don't really think it matters to us whether it says both or just one. I think we all understand what the intent is there, and we would certainly go with that.
Follow up?
Mr. Chairman, follow up. I think you said you had 15,000 miles of roads to maintain. And it's interesting that paragraph 1 kind of keeps the counties from buying machines that could maintain that 15,000 miles of road, the one machine that can do it. The 100,000 is probably not a problem because the counties buy at less taxes. So the price of the machine might be 200,000, but the county might buy it for 100 and some. But I kind of object to that. That means the counties could still buy a crusher or an asphalt plant and not have that $100,000 limitation, right?
Mr. Ryman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, I believe I'm confused. As I read the statute, as I understand the statute, there is no allowance to purchase any equipment. And in fact, the County Road Standards Committee advises against purchasing any equipment. And some of my counties have run afoul of that particular provision the last few years. And so one, we've dinged them, or the committee has dinged them for that use and alerted them that that is inappropriate. This provision that we've asked for, provision I, is simply to clarify that in this one particular instance with motor or road graders, that is acceptable up to the $100,000 on an annual basis.
Other questions? Other questions?
Yeah, follow up on that.
Senator Anderson.
You
follow up.
say they can't buy that other equipment. Do you mean out of this particular fund? They can't buy that. They can buy it with other funds.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, that's absolutely correct. They could purchase it with their other general revenues of the county.
Yeah, okay.
And that's what we've been trying to advise them they should do. This would just simply, in this one instance, allow them to purchase road and motor graders under this fund.
Other questions? So, Mr. Ryman, a question on your proposal on paragraph I. This also, correct me if I'm wrong, this also allows them to carry over $100,000 for that purchase. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is the intent, that they could set aside $100,000 this year, another $100,000 next year in order to purchase, the equipment that they needed, as long as it was a motor or road grader. And if I can, Mr. Chairman, just to carry that further, some counties do accumulate these funds for a period of years with the intent of being able to carry out a particular project, a bridge project that might cost them several $1 million. And so that is an allowance to carry over. Now, I will say the committee gathers that information and does monitor it. And if a county just seems to be piling cash for no good reason, the committee will advise them that they should pursue a project and engage contractors to do some of the work in their county.
Other questions? Okay. Well, with that, I'll open public comment. Is anyone in the audience wish to speak?
Good morning,
Gursky,
Mr.
please.
Chairman. I'm Katie Legursky with the Associated General Contractors of Wyoming. We are part of the working group. We do have one individual from Casper that serves on the Road Standards Committee. We did work directly with the individuals on these proposed changes. I'll be honest, we're not a huge fan of increasing the bidding threshold from 50,000 to 75,000, but in the spirit of cooperation, we did agree to the 75,000 in exchange for limiting what they can spend the funds on for equipment in particular. In the past, contractors have been concerned that the counties are buying crushers, that they are buying hot plants, that they are using the county road fund money rather than putting it on the roads to stockpile it, to buy equipment, to compete against the contractors. People within industry knows that when you purchase equipment, it's not good just to sit there for one project. It needs to be used on a regular basis. So in exchange for raising the threshold to 75,000, we agreed to go ahead and cap the equipment at 100,000 that could be spent strictly on a motor grader, because that is a portion that the counties do on a pretty regular basis on maintaining their county roads. So we are very supportive of these changes. We would adamantly oppose raising the bidding threshold any higher than 75,000. The other statutes throughout the state of Wyoming for any other public works contracts, that limit is 50,000, and that was just raised last year in House Bill 50, 51, and 52. We brought those standards up from 25,000 to 50,000. So going any higher than 75,000, we would definitely have a problem with, but we are very supportive of this proposed amendment, and I stand for any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Legursky? Any questions? Okay. Ms. Legursky, what can a contractor do for, say, 50,000, 75,000? To me, it looks like you have quite a bit of an expenditure in bidding versus what the work gets done. So give me an example, quick example, please.
It could be as simple there, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. It could be a small chip seal. It could be a major maintenance of going through and filling potholes in any of the paved roads they might have. It honestly varies depending upon the scope of the project and the type. And a project at 50,000 to 75,000, there really isn't that much expense that goes into preparing of a bid like there is in some of the YDOT projects that we're looking at, $45 million, $20 million. So the expense on a bid on that level is pretty minimal.
Thank you. Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I just have one for staff.
Representative Brown.
Heather, I know in other bills that we've worked with in the past, we tend to try to stay away from, I'm shocked to see that we even have in there the Wyoming Contractors Association currently in statute. We typically try to go broad with that. And so if we were to move forward with something like this, is that something that we should be looking at by naming out a contractor? I mean, for whatever reason, if the Associated General Contractors of Wyoming decided to not exist anymore, how does the governor pick somebody to be part of this road working group?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, you are correct. Typically in statute, when we have the membership of a group, we would say from the trucking industry, from the contracting industry, something like that.
Okay.
Or even from an association of members of the contracting industry or something like that.
Okay.
So Representative, there might be a bill in there for you.
And Mr. Chairman, if I just may add, if there is amendment in that, I would
Please.
qualify highway contractor.
Any other questions for Ms. Gursky? Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment from the audience in the room? Okay, anyone on virtual?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. With that, I'll close public testimony. Committee? Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if you want to take suggestions at the end of the meeting today, or if you want to take them one at a time. If it's your desire to maybe draft up what's been suggested to us, we could certainly do that.
Mr. Co-Chair, we're on it. I think we all have a good understanding now. We'll just, if someone wants to make a motion, I think right now would be a good time. Senator Pappas.
Chairman, I would move that we ask Dennis to prepare a bill for us for our next meeting.
Okay.
Second that.
Okay, seconded by Senator Anderson. Any discussion? Okay, hearing question called, all in favor, say aye. Opposed, no. Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Reaman, you're back up. You and Kelly both. And Kelly, I didn't mean to ignore you before. Okay.
Well, again, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, I'm Jeremiah Reaman here representing Wyoming's county commissioners. I'm joined for this part of the presentation by Kelly Little, who is our deputy director and a longstanding member of our staff who has focused on transportation issues for commissioners for a number of years and has been leading a working group on this particular issue around WyoLink. I want to start off, Mr. Chairman, by stating what I think everybody understands is that WyoLink is not a county system. It is a state system that came out of the September 11th tragedy of a couple of decades ago and was intended to improve communication across the state amongst various entities. Counties do have the option of coming into and utilizing the system, and the vast majority of counties have. We have just a couple of instances where counties are not a part of the system. For example, Sublette County chose to build and maintain its own system, and I'm not here to give any presentation on that, but they did go a different direction. It is interoperable with the WyoLink system, but they are not a direct participant. Mr. Chairman, for a number of years, the state has covered the operations and maintenance responsibilities of the WyoLink system, but over time, there has been some move to make users outside of the state pay for that system. The mineral royalty grant, which is a grant that local governments can access, has been utilized to cover the local government portion of that system for a number of years. But that source of funding is dwindling. And thus my members are very interested in ensuring that we can identify a mechanism to account for the ongoing operation and maintenance costs of the WyoLink system. And we have not been solely focused on our portion of that system. We've been trying to identify a mechanism that would also help the state and address its costs within the system. And that's what the working group has been working on. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kelly. I'll participate, but I think she's going to take us most of the way through this particular topic.
Ms. Little, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just for the record, my name is Kelly Little. I'm with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. As this committee is aware, we convened a working group over the interim to discuss funding options for the WyoLink system. As Jeremiah mentioned, currently the operations and the maintenance of the system is being, the local portion is being paid out of the federal mineral royalty grant program. But that account is predicted to be depleted by the end of this biennium, hence the need to find a different funding source. Okay, so the WCCA took on the task of spearheading this work group, and the goal is to find a sustainable long-term funding solution for the maintenance and software system upgrades of WyoLink system for all users. And if possible, the work group hopes to identify one or more funding recommendations that support the WyoLink system as a whole. So members of the work group, the primary members included the WCCA and county commissioners, the county sheriffs, the cities, the police departments, the fire departments, school boards, and YDOT. I also have an advisory capacity notation in there, and that includes Wyoming, the Wyoming vendor Motorola, excuse me, the telecommunications industry, and the Wyoming Taxpayers Association. Now, when I say advisory capacity, I included those folks because they either gave us a recommendation on a funding solution, or they provided data, or just support for this initiative.
Ms. Little, I've heard that some of these organizations feel they were not included. Could you address that, please?
So they were included, Mr. Chairman, as primary members of the advisory committee. The work group stakeholder members were our users of the system, those who would be receiving invoices or paying for the system if a funding solution is not found. The advisory capacity label, and maybe that's the wrong terminology, but I did want to include people who had given us ideas or data or support. So that's
Thank you.
the meaning behind that. All right, and just a little background information. I wanted to include this slide on how other states fund their emergency communication systems. As you can see there, there's a variety of different ways that states fund their system, including 911 fees, Department of Transportation funds. A lot of general fund revenue is used to fund the system. There's also some other creative ways, but you can read through there, some of our neighbors, how they are currently funding their systems. That's just informational for the committee. Any questions on that slide? Move ahead. So we do know that there's the possibility of some federal sources of funding that could provide funding for WyoLink or emergency safety communications, including the American Rescue Plan Act, which we have already engaged the governor's office, and we'll be working with them to try to see if it's possible to use some of that money to fund the system. And you can see there the dates that are when costs need to be obligated and incurred through 2026. And then there's also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's obviously a work in progress that has passed the Senate, but it still obviously needs to pass the House and be signed by the president. We haven't evaluated, we're not particularly sure if there's funding there, but we're just putting it out there that could be a possibility. More evaluation is needed on that particular piece of legislation. Okay, so now we'll get into the different, so I want to just put a caveat out there to the committee that the committee discussed a lot of different options. They're all listed here. We went through a pro-con exercise on all of these. These options are either historical options that have been attempted in the past to fund the system and for whatever reason were not successful. And they're also hypothetical options, that could be a source of revenue to fund this system. We just wanted to give the committee an entire look at what different attempts have been made and what we'd like to try in the future to fund the system. So the first option we talked about are various grants, and no specific grants were discussed. Different entities did say, there are particular grants that could be used for this portion, i.e. buying radios or, pieces of equipment. But this topic was more discussed in general terms. As you heard at the last Joint Transportation Committee meeting, the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security does have grants there that allow entities to purchase, equipment, but it is, as you can see on the pro and cons, under the cons, these grants may only be eligible for certain purchases and certain entities. The pros would be that it would replace and minimize the state local obligation to WyoLink, but The cons include, there's resources needed for grant writing, an unknown application process or requirements. It's unstable one-time funding, which we're trying to move away from, unknown grant cycles, and grants sometimes require matching funds. So it's a possibility to help, but it wouldn't be a solution all in and of itself. The next option we discussed was a surcharge on citations and convictions. This would be like, if you got a ticket, you would have, this is just an example, you'd have a $5 surcharge on that ticket, on that citation. And the pros of that would be that there is a nexus to the users because there's use of first responder and or law enforcement in those proceedings. However, we discussed the cons include the constitutional consideration that all of those monies are intended by the Constitution to go to the school systems. It's not a stable source of revenue, and there's not enough revenue generated. We did get some data that there's roughly 150,000 citations per year. And so at $5 per citation, it'd only be $750,000, or at even $10, it'd only be $1.5 million. I should have mentioned this. The goal is to fund the system is there's a rough estimate that it's $6 million annually to fund the system. That's maintenance, operations, and upkeep of the system in the future. So that's kind of the target number we've been looking at.
Ms. Little,
Yes,
your $6 million figure, is that statewide or only for the counties?
that's, Mr. Chairman, that is statewide. That includes the system as a whole.
So your considerations on this are for funding for the counties, towns probably included, or the state or all the entities?
Mr. Chairman, that would be all the entities.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, that all of those entities are, the state, which is, I believe, primarily WYDOT. It would include the counties, your county sheriff. It would include your municipalities. There are a lot of special districts that do tap into the WyoLink system, the school districts. Many of them utilize the system. So when we talk about that 6 million, that's to cover all entities. And that was our goal here. I mean, I think I mentioned this at the last meeting. My intent was not to come to you with a solution that just solved my problem. It seemed a little bit too self-serving that we needed to find a solution that could do everything.
Thank you. Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next option we discussed is an option that's actually already been implemented by the legislature, which is leasing tower space. WYDOT estimates that it will raise revenue of about 30,000 to 50,000 annually. The cons of this option and trying to use it as a funding mechanism for the WyoLink system as a whole is that it doesn't solve the issue for local entities. Right now that funding is flowing to WYDOT. There's no guarantee of revenue. There's no guarantee that there would be those contracts available for leasing those towers. And as you can see, there's not enough revenue generated, and a supplemental source of revenue would be necessary. So I do want to talk about this option. This is an increase in 911 fees. Again, just a reminder that these are historical efforts also. So this has been attempted in the past to increase the 911 fee to pay for the WyoLink system. The pros of using 911 fees is there's a nexus between the users and the fee, use of first responder and or law enforcement resources. And other states use 911 fees to fund their systems. However, the cons, we did want to look into the future, that we know that there's the next gen 911 initiative that's coming down the pike. We didn't want to, there's the cons would be that this would limit raising revenue for future capacity needs for 911 funding. And there is in the past, traditionally, there has been opposition from the telecommunications industry for this attempt. And, we've discussed with them what that looks like. And yeah, this one is one that's been attempted in the past, but was not successful.
Ms. Little, what are the current 911 fees?
They are 75 cents. I think in 2016, when this was attempted, it was a 20-cent increase in the fee to cover the cost of the Wyoming system.
Ms. Little, 75 cents per call, per line?
Per phone line.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
And I guess a follow up to myself, hard lines or are cell phones included?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to clarify that. We could find that information out. Okay.
Heather?
Mr. Chairman, all are included, including prepaid phones from like the convenience stores.
Okay, thank you.
And there was a bill draft proposed in 2019
17? I don't remember.
to increase well, it wasn't to increase 911 fees, but was to follow the 911 model of fees type on a person's phone bill.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can, just to be
Mr. Ryman,
clear, it's 75 cents per phone line. And it's up to that. So a local jurisdiction does not have to impose 75 cents. It could be a lower figure, but that is the current statutory cap.
Mr. Ryman, then how many jurisdictions do not levy the full fee?
Mr. Chairman, you're getting way beyond where I have information today, but I will certainly work to follow up and get that information.
And I believe probably you need to talk to the municipality association too.
Right. We've
Okay.
got access to the
Okay.
information.
Thank you. Ms. Little, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Heather mentioned, this was an attempt to raise the actual 911 fee in the recent past, but there also was an attempt. Get back to my right screen. I apologize. As Heather mentioned, there was an attempt to implement a public safety communications fee on phone bills. Again, that was an option that was discussed we just wanted to let this community know what we were talking about. So we did discuss this option as well. The pros of this option include that there is a nexus between users of the fee, phone users calling for emergency services. It's easily trackable and widespread. However, under cons, you can see there that I've listed that the legislature has previously rejected this proposal, and there is, again, opposition from the telecommunications industry on this. And it was as Heather mentioned, 2019, but that was an unsuccessful attempt to fund the system through this mechanism.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
thank you. Ms. Little, I missed that last bit of that. Did you say not only in 2016 that this came in front of the legislature, but it came back in 2019?
Ms. Little?
Mr. Chairman, yes, so there was an attempt to raise the actual 911 fee. And I believe that was in, try to see here, it was 2016 or 2017. And then in 2019, this mechanism, a completely separate fee called the public safety communications fee, was attempted and was unsuccessful. So two different kinds of a similar fee, raising the 911 fee or implementing a completely different fee.
I appreciate the reminder on the public safety communications fee.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. So I'm just trying to remember where that made it to and where it did not get to, because I don't remember it making it out onto the Senate floor or anything like that.
Ms. Little?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it was a committee sponsored bill out of this committee. However, it was during a budget session and did not pass the introductory vote to be introduced.
Thank you.
Ms. Little, proceed.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so moving to kind of a different area, the next option we discussed were vehicle registration fees. And this first option here would be using a percentage of the current fee revenue and earmarking it for Wyoming. We talked about carving off a percentage of the state and the local fee, because there are two parts to vehicle registration fees, and using that to pay for Wyoming. The pros of this option would be that there's no additional fee or tax. That's already a stable source of funding. It's easily trackable and could be split proportionally between the state and local entities. The cons would be there would be a reduction in revenue to entities receiving vehicle registration fee revenue. So that's any entity that receives property tax as well as YDOT. Some WyoLink users, but not all, would pay for the system this way. And it doesn't solve the local entity issue of decreased revenue to local entities. It just creates the burden in another form. There would still be a reduction in that to the local entities. So it doesn't really solve the funding issue. It's just a way to pay for the system. All right, and the next option we discussed is a vehicle registration fee increase. And I'll just run through the pros and cons real quickly. That include, the pros would be similar to the last one, that it's a stable source of funding, it's easily trackable, already implemented, it's widespread, and there's a nexus between the users, Wyoming drivers, and the fee. The cons would that it would be an increase in fees, and the legislature has been hesitant to raise registration fees. Just for, I'll move on to the next slide because that provides some data for the committee. In fiscal year 2020, there was a total of 1,039,000 roughly vehicles registered in Wyoming, which is $198 million in total revenue. 40.8 million of that is state revenue, and 157.3 million is local revenue, which I mentioned is distributed like property tax. So bulk majority of that goes to school districts, some to counties, cities, and then special districts. I did do some math. An increase of $6 per vehicle registration fee would garner roughly 6.2 million in revenue. An increase in $8 per registration fee would garner $8.3 million in revenue. So that's just some data for the committee.
Ms. Little, back up to the local revenue fees. Now, when we buy a driver's license or vehicle registration, there's a state fee and then there's a county fee. I thought for most of the counties, that fee was basically their operating money for the year. Am I correct or not? I guess, Mr. Ryman, that goes to you.
Mr. Chairman, to that question, the county portion of vehicle registration fees ends up being distributed to local entities just the same way that property tax is in the state of Wyoming. So in other words, about 73% of that money goes to school districts. About 17% goes to counties, to their general fund. So yes, it does allow for some general operations. And then the remainder of that goes to special districts within that particular jurisdiction. So again, in short, you can think about vehicle registration fees at the county level, just like property tax.
Okay, thank you. Continue, please.
All right, the next option would be also related to vehicle registration fees, but we thought about different ways of implementing an increase in fees. And this would be an amortized fee increase based on the vehicle age. Again, similar pros, stable source, already implemented, easily trackable, widespread, a nexus. But another pro was that it would be less of an increase for newer vehicles, and then that increase would go up as the vehicle ages. The cons, again, would be an increase in the fees and the hesitancy of the legislature in the past to raise those fees.
Ms. Little,
Yes, sir.
what's the logic for the difference between older vehicles and newer vehicles. I mean, there are many people that they cannot afford and never will be able to afford to buy a new vehicle and rely on that used vehicle market and drive older vehicles. I mean, there are a lot of vehicles on the road that are 20 years old or more because that's what the owners can afford. They can't afford a $100,000 pickup truck that's brand new. So I'm just curious as to why that difference between, you know, new vehicles and old vehicles. I guess, Mr. Ryman, the mic has been passed to you.
Mr. Chairman, I'll try and answer the question simply because this is an idea I was trying to throw everything at the wall and see if we could come up with a system that could work. I think that the idea being here is a couple-fold. One, for new vehicles, so for a 2022 vehicle, the registration fees are at their absolute highest and will be so for, you know, first couple of years. And then, of course, over time, those fees go down. So the concept being that we wouldn't hit you with this particular fee when you're paying at the highest, we would pay it as, we would increase it as the registration fees go down. And, you know, in theory, you're still paying less than you were when that vehicle was new. So even though it was an increase on an older vehicle, it had decreased over time. So that was one part of it. You know, another part of the theory is that, you know, older vehicles are more subject to you know, problems and might encounter the need for emergency services in order to assist you. And so you would be paying for a higher fee at the point when your vehicle might be sort of demanding your need of services. Whether any of those make any sense or are appropriate, I don't know. Again, we were trying to throw things at the wall and see what stuck, and that was what the concept does. And we were just playing with the numbers, as you can see on slide 15, of what that could look like.
Thank you. Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you happen to have in your working group the, you know, the numbers to go with your, I mean, how many newer vehicles, how many vehicles per age group, you know what I'm saying, who've had to use the service? Do you have that information?
Representative?
It's in your packet.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
I
Representative.
didn't see that. I didn't see.
Yeah, it's
Withdraw the question.
on slide 15, it does show the proportion of registered vehicles.
This is the packet we just got.
Right. And to just be really clear, and I don't want to, well, maybe I'll just have you explain it.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to just give a little bit of a background on the formula that's used to calculate the county fee and the different years of service. So the county fee is the factory cost of a vehicle times the year of service times 3%. And that gets you to the county fee. So, and a vehicle that it's in its, you know, you can see on there, there's 2022 and 2021 vehicles. Those would be in their first year of service. They're taxed at a 60% times that 3% rate. And then the schedule goes down like 60%, 50%, 40, 30, 20, and then 15 at the 6-year mark. And that's when the fee bottoms out. It stays the same for the rest of the life of the vehicle. So in this table on slide 15, you can see we, you know, have that same kind of amortization schedule. And we just propose the fee at, you know, $3 starting. And then when you get to that 6th year, it's $8. So it's just, you know, $5 difference between the first year, but it is a little less at the beginning because they're paying that 60%. And at the end, they're only paying that 15%. So that's kind of the argument there to make it a little less stark.
Representative Henderson.
Right. Thank you. I see the logic behind the table that you provided. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But Mr. Chairman, what I'm asking is going on the theory of going back to some of your earlier proposals regarding those who've had a nexus of using this system, how many people who have these vehicles in 2020, for example, use the service for each year group? I mean, is there any substantiation to show that someone who maybe has a lower income base has an older vehicle and has had it for some time and has been dutifully paying their registration, has used the service? That's what I'm looking for. Thank you.
Mr. Ryman.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Henderson, as I mentioned, it was a theory. It's not that I have any data to substantiate that whatsoever. It just is, I think the reality is older vehicles are more subject to breakdowns and potentially interacting with the system, but I have nothing to support that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Senator McCune.
Would you agree that we're almost proposing a regressive tax? If there are a lot of older vehicles, most of the people that are buying them are on the lower end of the income scale, and they're going to pay more taxes than the people who have money.
Mr. Ryman.
Mr. Chairman, I want to be very clear that I don't, we're not necessarily proposing anything here. And so I don't know that I have the answer to you. What we're just simply trying to do is be creative within the system we have of how could you impose these fees in a way that didn't hit you when you had the highest costs within the system, but rather impose the highest cost when you were paying, say, 15%. And this, as we put there, it's a sample scenario. You can put any sort of numbers in here. You could make it more regressive against the newest vehicle and cheapest against the oldest vehicle, as we do in our current system. We're playing with numbers and scenarios here.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. I just want to say thank you. It's not really much of a question because honestly, what you were tasked with was to form this working group, come up with some ideas, come up with some potential solutions. Because what we've been hearing in this committee since I've been on here for the past 5 years is Wyoming's a problem. We have to figure out how to pay for it. County commissioners, you guys seem to be the ones that have the hardest portion of this. We're asking you to pay for this. And we stuck that task onto you. And you guys formed your working group. And you guys did exactly what we asked you to do. None of which is an easy task for you guys to accomplish, especially considering your membership and what you guys are tasked to do on a daily basis. So I just want to say thank you for doing exactly what this committee asked you to do, which is to provide some ideas for solutions. None of which are you guys suggesting is the golden ticket to take care of everything. I've not heard that one time in here. What I've heard is here's some ideas. This is what we came up with. And these are the thoughts. Legislature, do what you will. And I appreciate that. That's our job. And so sitting on this side of the dais, it's our job to make those tough decisions. And it's our job to sit there and have to stand behind taking those votes. You guys did exactly what we asked you to do. And we're coming to the end of the presentation. And instead of waiting till then, where you guys are getting barraged with these questions on, well, why are you doing it this way? Right? You guys did it the way you were supposed to do it. And I thank you. So thank you to you, Mr. Reeman, Ms. Little, and the entire County Commissioners Association for spearheading this. And also thank you publicly to everybody who partook in this entire process, because this is not an easy task to undertake. So
And
thank
your
you.
question is?
Mr. Chairman, I started saying there was no question.
Continue.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, we could pick 2 or 3 of these solutions and maybe not have the full amount that you have in there. We could do any combination of this. It isn't an either or kind of thing. Is that correct?
Ms. Little.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I think that is really the legislature's will. If there are, if it's easier to spread it out amongst, 3 different ways to do it, then we would be supportive of that, because it is hard. I think to answer a question earlier, this proposed fee that you're seeing right now, like it's just an idea, it's just an example. This would be equivalent, a $6 across the board raise in registration fees, whether it has to do with, phone bills, whether it has to do with other, it just, there is a way to spread it out. I think that could be a little bit here and a little bit there, and then it's not as painful as trying to raise revenue in one general area.
Continue. I think you have one more slide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there's no more questions on that, the sample scenario for that amortized fee increase, we also had this idea, and this is pending whether there is American Rescue Plan money that could cushion the system for the immediate future. This would be a gradual increase implementation on an increase in registration fees. Similar pros that we've talked about to the other vehicle registration fee options, but our idea is to just increase them, over the next 3 to 4 years. One of the pros that's added to that would be that there's a way to build a reserve for, upkeep of the system into the future. Emergency, if there's a tower goes down, say, then there's a little bit of buffer to kind of a rainy day fund, if you will, to pay for that kind of emergency. Again, the cons are it's an increase in fees and that the legislature has been hesitant to increase those fees. So that's the end of the options that we've discussed, the pro-con exercise that the work group went through, and we kind of discussed all of those in depth. So now we just take any other questions that the committee has.
Questions for the County Commissioners Association? Representative Brown, you have a question this time?
There is a question here. Ms. Little, throughout the whole process, you guys have given us the packet of everything there. Was there necessarily discussion from the working group as to which one they deemed to be more appropriate, or maybe maybe more of the golden ticket that we were trying to get to, that the county commissioners saw as the larger area? We've got a whole list. I'm just kind of curious if there was one that you guys thought was the better way to go.
Right.
Mr. Ryman?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, and I do want to just state that this wasn't an exercise that we wanted to go through, but we feel it's important. We have a system that is critical to our emergency communications across the state and a lot of other things. And so it was important that we try and for once and for all figure this out. And this has been something that you all and we all have been trying to work on for at least a decade to get to a solution. And we've really just been robbing different systems, whether that's YDOT robbing the highway fund or our counties, taking from the mineral royalty grant. With that said, I think the two solutions that we think are the most appropriate to move forward with are first to utilize American Rescue Plan funds. We have a significant amount of money coming into the state that will allow us to prepay operations and maintenance for the next 4 or 5 years and deal with the issue. The problem is that is a short-term solution. It doesn't get us to what ultimately we have here. So we do need to have a secondary system. And I don't want to even presume that we can, that you all will say ARP is the right funding for this. So all that leaves us, we do have to have a backup here. I think the solution that the working group sort of centers in on amongst the various options that are available to us is the option that's presented on page 11, dealing with registration fees and in particular pulling a percentage away from the existing registration fee system. So what that does is One, it hits the majority of the users of the system, whether that's the school districts, the special districts, the counties, and the state. I mean, you do have to impose it on both the state and the county. So you do hit those users. It is a solution that requires no additional fee or fine or tax to be implemented. It is money that is there. And I apologize, I don't have the numbers immediately in front of me. So it is a system that could be used. Now, if we can use ARP funding for the next 4 or 5 years, I still think there's wisdom in moving forward with an option, even if we have to have a delayed implementation or sort of a phased implementation, because it would allow us to build some small reserve before we go into it. So I hope that helps. That's the one that I think we sort of mostly focus on. Although I would say with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, all of them are viable options.
Follow up, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just out of curiosity, when you start talking about the property tax and the severing off, was there any discussion with the county treasurers on the implementation of that, what that would look like and how hard that may make their jobs to set aside a portion of this? Just out of curiosity, whether or not that was ever brought forward.
Ms. Little?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, we haven't talked to the treasurers, but that is definitely a step in the process, depending on what the committee decides they want to do with the solutions. And that is definitely something we would bring them in the fold and make sure that it is implemented in a way that works for them as well as at the working group. So
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Rima, thanks for your thoughts on that. And I'm certainly following and am on board with several of the notions that you've had. I just want clarification. I think this is the case, but when we talk about this vehicle tax, we're not just talking about cars and trucks. I think that it would include, for example, ORVs and boats, would it not? I just wanted that clarification.
Mr. Chairman, yes, that.
Mr. Ryman?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, yes. Yeah, with the caveat that it's at your discretion of which ones you would ultimately want to impose that on.
Well, just as a comment, Mr. Chairman, that goes into the world of search and rescue and all kinds of things that go on in Wyoming. And it certainly would make sense that if we're going to consider something like that, it wouldn't be just cars and trucks. So thank you.
Boats for sure.
Other questions?
No, not boats.
Any other questions for the county commissioners? Okay. With that, I'll then open public testimony. And I think Director Reiner, do you have any comments you would like to make on this?
I thought about that quite a while. This might be really good.
Yeah, he may have said no.
Yeah, but Mr. Chairman, I certainly we'd thank.
Director Reiner, please.
Yeah, thank you. For the record, Luke Reiner, Director White Eye. Our comments would be, we thank the counties and the county commissioner for association for taking the lead on this. Certainly 2 years ago, White Eye did have the lead and we were the ones that really brought forward this concept of an emergency use fee added to the telephone lines. And so that worked through the process. And 2 years later, we're here talking about other options. And I think that's the way the system works. And so we stand, ready to support in this discussion and certainly participated, Mr. Babbitt participated in the working group.
All right. Thank you, Director. Thank you. Questions for the Director? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I do have one.
Oh, Director, you got to come back.
Just one quick question for you, Director.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, at one point, we had started seeing testing of and what invoices were going to look like, stuff like that. Is that continued, or was that kind of a one and done design? We tested the invoices, we heard from those that were receiving them, and now we're going back to research it a little bit. Do we have any information on what that looks like?
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, no, that continues. That's a legislative directive. And so every quarter I send out a love note to all users of the system that says, hey, be advised. Here's what your bill would be if you needed to pay it. And so that does continue.
Thank you.
And that system is in place if we need to, when we run out of money and we need to implement it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, could you refresh my memory on what is your assessment of how these bills are received among the counties?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I would say the comment would be negatively.
Did you say interesting?
Negatively.
Negative.
Follow-up?
Do we have, Mr. Chairman, do we have any idea what the capacity is currently among the counties for this emergency response system, basically? So what I'm thinking is, if you look at the other services we provide related to emergency response, no individual county, like no individual resident, has the ability or capacity to fund those. And so there's sort of as time goes by, you sort of get a central tendency of an amount that gets allocated to each of us and each county and so on at each level of government. And I'm just wondering, have we thought about an allocation of a statewide percentage? For example, for a state system like this, would it be possible to assess a percentage of the amount to run the program, to have the program and go forward? Like say 75% for the state from state resources and 25% of the cost from county resources. Has that been considered?
Director?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I think my comment to that would be, is that's really the concept behind the current billing system. It's based on the usage of the system. So in my mind, that would be the capacity that you're discussing there. And so it's very objective. It basically takes the amount of use that you use the Wyoming system, and that's how we generate the bill. And it's not subjective at all. It's very objective based on use. And then we send out the bills as directed by the legislature to the users based on their use. So I would say that the system that's currently in legislation is exactly the system that you just described.
Just one final quick follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on that then, I want to be clear, is the state picking up the majority of the cost, if you will?
Director?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, the state is currently picking up most of the cost, yes. Now,
Excuse me. Would it do
Representative?
so under your billing model? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Henderson, under the current billing process, as the state is picking up the bill. Now, what's interesting about that is that the money that's being used to fund the county portion in terms of usage actually comes from money that would be allocated to counties anyway. And so I do think there's a great benefit to saying we all use the money. Well, I would correct, we all use the system. And wouldn't it be nice if we just had one sustainable funding source and we got out of this trying to track who's exactly using the system and who's not? Because here's the complexities that you start getting into here is it's a system of systems. And we work collaboratively with the counties. There are counties that have 800 megahertz systems. And Wyoming uses those in the performance of our day-to-day business. We ride on each other's backs. And so it becomes one of these issues of, well, if the state charges for Wyoming, then the counties could conceptually say, well, you're using our system, so we're going to charge you back. And it just starts getting into this sort of murky, circular discussion of who's going to pay who and how's that all going to work. And so I'm certainly an advocate of one single funding source that takes care of everything. I think the other thing that I would say, and we've said this publicly before, is what's not included in this discussion here. Well, let me back up. Right now, the counties have a lot of skin in this game. And the skin that they have in this game is the purchase of the original equipment in terms of consoles and radios. That doesn't even count for airtime and all the tower infrastructure that the state provides. And so that's where you start talking about is a system of systems. And maybe let's just take one central funding source and just fund the whole thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, what I basically hear you saying, and I think I'm maybe a little easier way to say this is if we have a major forest fire in Bighorn County that causes something, the last thing we want to do is sit there and worry about billing Bighorn County for their usage of the WildLink system at the end of the fire and everything along those lines. We'd rather just have this availability to the counties and anybody who needs to use it statewide without having to go through that billing process. And the way to do that is by having a uniform billing process. Is that right?
Correct. Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I completely agree with that. It is, I think this is one of those things where we all live and operate and work in this state. We have multiple levels of government. We've got individuals and everybody benefits from this system. And it's a great system and it's used 12 million times a year and it saves lives every day. And it's worth, I think it's worth a discussion of saying, hey, let's just solve this funding issue once and for all. And let's make it centralized and let's fund the entire system like the counties suggest, and we completely concur with that, and simplify the discussion.
Thank you.
Other questions for the director? Director, I have one. Going back to the previous meeting that we've had a little bit of discussion on WildLink and the federal assistance funding that might be available right now. If you were asked, could you provide even a more in-depth suggestion of what we would recommend on up the chain of command to the Joint Appropriations Committee, to the executive branch? I happen to be sold committee on the fact that some of these ARPA funds belong in this infrastructure. That's really, in my opinion, that's part of the purpose of what those funds are being made available for. We could do a lot of things with it. We've got a lot of people knocking on the door, but this is something that's tangible. And Director, what sorts of things can you suggest to us, just maybe in a general way this morning, that helps us understand where we could go with that money?
Sure.
If we could get behind you and suggest, do we still have dead spots that we can fix? Can you help me with where would we go with this ARPA funding? And then consider following it with something like we've suggested.
Yeah, you bet, Mr. Chairman, would be happy to. First, what I'd say is I think that the county's recommendation to leverage rescue funding is spot on while we implement a long-term solution. And there is, in our exception budget request that has been submitted to the governor and is working through the process, there is monies requested in that process to replace the components that need to be replaced right now. And that's our Quantars radios, that's our DC power supplies. There's a couple towers that are really getting at capacity. We need increase the capacity in those certain towers. And so conceptually, that's already in there. Also in there, I believe, and I'll have to double check this one, is the ability to do some operational costs. But certainly, this is a chance for us to upgrade the system using the rescue funds. And our understanding is that fits very neatly within the parameters and the requirements of those funds. So that's there. Also, at this point, we do have the recommendation for an additional 2 towers. And based on really what we've seen as operational realities around the state, because we do think that if you're using this system for emergency response around the state, you absolutely have to have good comms. So we see critical too. There would be, if we wanted to take some of the extra money and say, hey, we wanted to basically sort of polish off the system, there's an extra 15 that you could add. We have not requested those based on trying to be respectful of fiscal limitations. So Mr. Chairman, that's really where we're at, but we would certainly concur, and it's in the process, that we should use ARPA money to replenish the system and set the conditions for the future.
Thank you, Director and Committee. I hope that helps as a reminder of where we are. And you might remember a discussion of at least forwarding a memo from your chairman on up to the Joint Appropriations Committee in support of that exception request. And we'll perhaps discuss that at the end of the meeting today so that we can make any other suggestions that the committee might want to be sure to include. To me, all of this makes sense. And Director, I just don't want to undershoot the runway. I think it's one of the more important topics that we have on our interim list committee. And so I appreciate the fact, Director, that you have some things outlined and they're in the pipeline. Let's just think about whether or not we want to add that little bit of frosting that you talked about and finish this right. So,
yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else, committee? Any questions? Thank you, Director.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Any other public testimony on this? Okay, anyone in the room? Do we have anyone out in the virtual waiting room?
Mr. Chairman, we do have Mr. Byron Odekoven and Miss Jody Levin online.
Who was that again, Amanda? Byron Odekoven, and who else?
Jody Levin.
Okay, all right. If you would go ahead and admit them.
They're both admitted. They just need to turn on their mic and video.
Okay, Mr. Odekoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Byron Odekoven, the Executive Director for the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. Thank you for allowing me to join you remotely this morning to cover a topic that's near and dear to sheriffs and chiefs, and that is the funding for WyoLink. And first, I want to start with the discussion or praise the discussion led by the county commissioners as they were tasked with looking at all options. As you heard, some are not as palatable as others, but they certainly fulfilled your marching orders of look at all the options and present what they are. And I'm hopeful that we can come to a solution for the long term, much as the director pointed out, for the betterment of all, for the communication during emergencies. And we've already discussed some fires and events, vehicle usage, motorboats, RVs, all of those kinds of things play a part in that WyoLink emergency communication system that we're sensitive to the need to be able to fund long term. So let me put a couple things in perspective, or at least tidbits of information along the way. We did have representation from sheriffs on the working group committee, and they were very active in offering their support and suggestions that you've heard. So I want to offer that. Two, WyoLink is a work in progress. As the director mentioned, there's several towers that are yet to be built or yet to be established or yet to even be licensed, so to speak. And I'm reminded that, for example, Teton County has received those bills for what would be perceived WyoLink usage. And yet Teton County up until last year did not have WyoLink and now has it in a very limited capacity as we negotiate with the federal government on tower locations and tower sites. So we're, as the director pointed, it is a system of systems within a system, hoping to have a system that communicates with everyone. When you think about coming off of WyoLink onto that local entity and back onto WyoLink, much as in Teton County or Sublette County or in Natrona County, when the fire happened a couple of years ago and WyoLink went down and the whole fire system relied back on the county system, of which WyoLink operates their towers on the county system. Again, that system within a system that supports everything. So there's a host of issues that I would hope that, as the director pointed out, we would not get into that quid pro quo moment of who pays for what based on who sent me the bill last. I would much rather that we end up with a sustainable, succinct funding source for the benefit of the entire system. And with that, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Mr. Odekoven? Questions? None? Okay, thank you, Mr. Odekoven, very much.
Thank you. I'll
Ms. Levin.
stick around for additional comments or questions if they happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My apologies for appearing remotely this morning. I had an obligation that I could not get out of. So I do appreciate the ability to participate in this manner. My name is Jody Levin. I am testifying today on behalf of Verizon and Charter. Just a couple of things that I thought was important to clarify based on the presentation. It does list the telecom industry in an advisory capacity. The industry did not participate in the working group. Some of the suggestions that were included in the presentation are in fact ideas that came from the telecom industry, but I would say those are ideas that when we were put on the spot 2 years ago in testimony on did we have other ideas to fund the system, those were quick ideas that came kind of off the top of the head. So I certainly think that there could be more merit looked into with some of these ideas, but the industry does oppose the use of customer bills to fund the system. When a customer calls 911, that's what they're calling. They're calling the 911 system, not necessarily WyoLink. And the system of 911 is funded by, as Mr. Ryman and Ms. Little indicated, it's a surcharge on your bill up to 75 cents. I believe 22 of the 23 counties are now all at 75 cents. For a long period of time, 2 counties were only at 50 cents, Park and Sublette. But that's a per line, per month charge. So I think the average household, the figure is you now have about 6 devices. So each customer household is paying about $4.50 a month towards the 911 system. That's still not adequate to fund 911. So when you start talking about diversion of 911 fees, you're kind of eroding one system to try to benefit another system. And that's been one of the concerns of industry, is that it's not actually a stable funding source. And to put additional fees on a customer's bill, it's one of the things that industry hears about most from customers. They don't like it. Taxes, fees, surcharges, assessments, whatever you want to call it, when you use the phone bill as a kind of a tax collector, it can add upwards of 20% to a customer's bill. So these are significant fees that get added, and customers really don't like it. Industry beyond that, WyoLink, I think we all agree is a beneficial system. Emergency response and coordination between entities is critically important. It's really not industry's issue. It only becomes a concern to industry when we get pulled in for use of customer bills. And so I did think that context was important to provide to the committee. There are some outstanding questions about an FCC rule that just recently was changed on use of 911 funds to fund alternative emergency response systems, in addition to the federal FirstNet system. And there's, I think, probably something this committee will want to ask questions about in the future is the coordination between those two systems going forward. FirstNet is just being built out, so it's years before this is really an issue, but it is something to consider going forward because it has the same purpose, at least intent-wise, that Wyoming does. So again, not here to really discuss the merits of Wyoming, other than to say, of course, it's an important system, but industry was not involved in this working group, and I did think it was important to clarify that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Levin. Any questions for Ms. Levin? Any questions? Okay, Ms. Levin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please come forward, identify yourself.
Am I on?
We're always on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. And we really appreciate the committee taking their time on this, and we appreciate the opportunity to have participated in the working group, and thank all of those that did, and especially Ms. Little for her leadership in that. Appreciate the presentation that she gave, and I don't have really much to add to what's been said, other than to echo that we feel it's important to come up with a simple and sustainable way to fund the system. I don't think that there's anybody in the room that doesn't recognize the importance of the system, and we also think that it's appropriate to leverage ARPA funds to the degree possible, but obviously, again, as was stated earlier, that's a short-term solution, and so a long-term solution is in order. And again, I think keeping that simple and related to the usership is appropriate. With that, I would take any questions that the committee has.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So David, what I think I'm hearing, I want to get verification from you. If we were to draft something that suggested one of these options, which would kick in after potential federal funding would help bridge the gap, do I hear that the municipalities might support such an effort?
Mr. Fraser?
Thank you for the question. The answer is yes. We obviously would have preference toward some above others. Specifically, to be specific, I believe that diverting an existing revenue stream to it is less desirable than creation of a new stream. For example, a simple graduated or not, a simple addition to the registration fee, for example, would be, I believe, preferable. And again, there's certainly a lot of different ways to skin this cat, and we certainly will be supportive of coming to a solution.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Fraser, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public testimony? With that, I'll close public testimony.
Mr. Chairman, we do have one online,
Oh.
Mr. Brett Moline.
All right, thank you. If you would go ahead and admit him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau. I'm assuming you can hear me? No.
Continue, Mr. Moline. We can hear you.
Well, that was a good one. Considering the increase in vehicle registrations, is there a way to have it so that would not be on trailers? My organization understands the importance of WyoLink, especially during the fire seasons, how imperative it is for agencies to be able to communicate. But given that a lot of my agricultural members have a lot of trailers, I cannot support a fee increase based on my policy, but it would be less, it'd be less hurtful if it was not on the trailers. And my logic on that is trailers are pulled by a vehicle that it would be paying the fee. So essentially, if you're pulling a trailer, you're paying it twice. And if we could take it off of trailers, that would be less hurtful to my members. Thinking of one member that just pops into my head, he's got about 15 trailers that he uses for different things. And if we could not have to pay it on that, it would be less repulsive. That's not the word I'm looking for, but it'd be less hurtful to my organization. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd sit for any questions.
Any questions from Mr. Moline? Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, Brett, I'm surprised you're not asking us for F9, the ag exemption.
Mr. Moline?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, I believe that's F13.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Moline? Okay. Mr. Moline, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other public testimony? Anyone else in the waiting room, Amanda? No. Okay, with that, I will close public testimony. If you didn't raise your hand, you're out of luck. So with that, committee,
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Brown.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to have LSO draft legislation. And it would be in basically two parts, but it would encompass using ARPA funds subject to the availability of those funds. Also requesting that the two chairmen of this committee draft a letter to joint appropriations asking for, support of that. But then it would also, it would request that LSO work with the WCCA working group to utilize the existing property tax structure from registration and carve out